Chicago Bulls basketball is almost back. In a little over 24 hours, we'll actually be talking about a Chicago Bulls basketball game again. I don't know about you guys, I'm pretty excited about that. But until then, we still have a lot of predictions happening for the Chicago Bulls, as Hoopshype has predicted the Chicago Bulls finish 10th in the Eastern Conference. And depending on how your outlook is for the season, that could either be a really good finish or a bad season for the Chicago Bulls, depending on how you want to see the team prioritize their top 10 pick. Plus, Chicago Bulls ranked number 2nd in rosters that don't make sense. We're going to talk about all that plus more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. I'm the host here, Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into this content for today, y'all. We're going to start off with this article from Hoopshype, in which they were going through predicting every team's record, and they predicted the Chicago Bulls finish 4th in the Central Division and 10th in the Eastern Conference overall, which would mean that the Bulls finish in the play-in. Now, the Bulls don't make the play-in, that still gives them a chance at a lottery pick if they don't make it out the play-in into the actual playoffs. But this is going to be something that, some Bulls fans that want to see the Bulls prioritize their top 10 pick are going to say, hey, I don't know about that. Now, for the record, ESPN predicted the Bulls to finish 4th in the Central Division, but 12th in the Eastern Conference. And then, of course, a lot of sports books have the Bulls finishing at 27.5 to 28.5 wins is where the common line seems to be with the Chicago Bulls. Now, I've asked you guys over the last few weeks your prediction for the Chicago Bulls, and there are some Bulls fans that think the Bulls can win over 40 games. And there are some Bulls fans that think that the predictions are going to be where they are. Now, the interesting thing about Hoopshype in this article, when they listed the Bulls' strengths, they talked about the young core of Josh Giddey, Manas Bucilis, Kobe White, and Patrick Williams, and the potential versatility that they bring to the court for the Chicago Bulls, and questioning if they can form a solid foundational set of pieces for the Chicago Bulls for the team's future. Now, this is something that, Bulls fans have waved back and forth. And I also got to sit this when it comes down to it. Why the consistent disrespect of Ayo Dosunmu? Why the consistent disrespect of Ayo Dosunmu? When you talk about listing the Bulls' young core and young pieces, why do so many of these outlets continue to miss Ayo Dosunmu and the growth that he have, the youth, I don't understand what Ayo Dosunmu has to do to get more respect from the national media. I just don't understand what that is, and it has to stop, right? It just has to stop. I get it. Ayo Dosunmu isn't this star-level piece or anything like that. In no way am I even saying that. He has not shown that yet at all. But to say that he's one of the better two-way players in the NBA, when you look at what he did last year, now, of course, he has to show that he can do that again, right? Last year could very well be a fluke, but you gotta look at Ayo Dosunmu, especially post All-Star break. In the 23 games post All-Star break, Ayo Dosunmu averaged 16.8, so basically 17 points per game on 50% shooting. He shot the ball 38% from three, taking 5 3-pointers per game, 3.6 rebounds, 5.2 assists, over a steal and a half per game. The Ayo Dosunmu is one of the best value contracts in the NBA, and I need everybody else. You know what? No, don't let Ayo Dosunmu keep flying under the radar nationally. But when your favorite guard gets shut down by Ayo Dosunmu, or Ayo Dosunmu forces them to have a difficult night, or Ayo Dosunmu coming off that bench is pushing the transition to alley-oops to Manas Bucilis, or finishing around the rim himself, I think people will start taking notice then. The disrespect to Ayo Dosunmu has to stop. When you're listing some of the Bulls' best young pieces, Ayo Dosunmu's name needs to be listed in that, period. I'm sorry, welcome to my TED Talk, but I'm tired of the disrespect to Ayo. And Ayo Dosunmu, on top of that, is growing into the leader of this team. So for the people who doubt and who don't mention Ayo Dosunmu's name, you're going to start seeing it very shortly after. But anyway, in this article, they mentioned the Bulls' young core of Josh Giddey, Manas Bucilis, Kobe White, Patrick Williams, and Ayo Dosunmu in that when it comes down to it. And they also talked about how, Billy Donovan finally now has the multiple ball handlers that he tends to like with his system, and asking the question of, are they going to be able to do that? If this Bulls team can run the floor, they can be kind of more like how he ran his offense in 2019-20 with that OKC Thunder team. And I'll tell you what, I can honestly see that a little bit. And I think also you're missing out on Jalen Smith, him being an acquisition to this team that can play in transition as well. Of course, we got to see what Julian Phillips and Dalen Terry are going to do as well. But those are also players that can do some handling of the ball, but more importantly, they can get out in transition. So, I'm glad to see that some outlets are starting to be kind of more optimistic about what the Bulls can be. And of course, it comes down to, again, how veterans like Zach LaVine and Nikola Vucevic and Torrey Craig and even Lonzo Ball, coming back now, how healthy they can stay, but then also how they play within this new system that the Bulls are trying to implore. So, that is, as far as listed as the strengths, I can understand that. Now, as far as the weaknesses that Hoopshype lists in this article, they talk about the lack of front court depth for the Chicago Bulls. And here's one thing that I'll say to that. Welcome to Chicago. This has really been kind of the norm when it comes down to the team, basically since AK has taken over. We've had a lack of front court depth. We just have. Like, I guess initially in that first season, when AK and Eversley took over, when we had Wendell, still Laurie, Daniel Gafford was still here, that may have been the most depth that we had at a front court position. I think Thad Young was still on that team at that point in time as well. Patrick Williams was a new addition as well to that front court. So that was probably the most depth we've had in the front court ever. Now, as far as the center position, we've never really had a whole lot of depth at center. Again, that's kind of that's just how AK is building the team apparently. And so that front court depth is something that's always been a concern for Bulls and Bulls fans, right? I think, a major injury to either Nikola Vucevic or Jalen Smith, it starts bringing about some questions. Now, you do have Adama Sanogo down there in the G League that I think is ready to see some NBA minutes as well. I will really like to see him get some NBA minutes. I think he's already shown that he's above that level of competition in the G League. Kenny Lofton Jr., another guy who, why doesn't have the height, is another big body down there that can bang down low if you need him to be. So maybe the Bulls are kind of more adept if they need to with what they have out there in the G League and stuff like that. But, overall, as far as weaknesses as well outside of that front court, they talk about shooting inconsistency. And I love that that's a point in this because I think that's an interesting angle to take on the Bulls shooting aspect of things. Because, some Bulls fans will have the conversation of, well, look at what Io and Zach and Kobe can do shooting-wise and Patrick Williams, but the consistency part of it, right? Because Kobe, he'll tell you, one of the biggest holes in his game is his inconsistency at times, right? Like, he'll have 5 great, amazing games, and then 2 or 3 games where he can't hit anything. Then he'll get back to being amazing. Then a couple of games of being so-so, right? Zach LaVine is consistent in that way, I think. Io DeSumo, I think, showed a lot more consistency last season than what people give him credit for. Like going and looking at the month to months, for example, like in the month of April, for example, Io DeSumo shot 46% from 3. In the month of March, 38% from 3. In the month of February, 46% from 3. In the month of January, 46% again, and then 31% in the month of December. So I can see that inconsistency kind of being there. Again, when you're even star level players have some inconsistent nights. So shooting inconsistency definitely could be a thing for the Chicago Bulls team as well. And then especially when you look at the defensive aspect of it as well. So these are all things that could really play into the Bulls' weaknesses big time. And it just comes down to this. Like, if you can really make a case for this Bulls team to be much better or much worse than any type of predictions. I've had the conversation here, but I think an underrated part of this that I think we need to talk more about, and I honestly think if the Bulls don't do any type of training camp releases today, I know I've been doing the end of like the regular day kind of live streams, and I may do a live stream on this, and that's the importance of what Dan Craig and Wes Unseld Jr. are bringing to this team, right? Look at these are 2 guys that have worked under some of the best coaches in the NBA. Especially, you look at Wes Unseld Jr., where, it didn't work out for him as a head coach. That's why, as an assistant, I'm specifically focusing in his job as an assistant, being under Malone, being under that Denver team and what he's been able to do already, taking the head of the defense there, right? Taking that leadership of that defense here so far in training camp. And then you look at Dan Craig. Dan Craig's a really interesting piece to be here because Dan Craig's worked under Eric Spoelstra and Tyronn Lue. These are 2 of the coaches that are looked at as 2 of the better coaches in the NBA. And I really do think that Dan Craig could have taken a job at another prestige. Honestly, I'm more surprised that Dan Craig hasn't moved over to being a head coach yet. Now, maybe he has no no desire to be a head coach. Some coaches are just great at being the assistants. They don't want to deal with the headache of being head coaches. That comes with a whole different level of pressure and responsibility and things like that. But look at these two guys adding two very big veteran assistant coaches that have been a part of very important winning programs, how that really helps this team, helps Billy Donovan with his coaching as well. And I do think that and I'm not saying that this is the case, we'll see what happens with this season, but the Bulls may have also set up a succession plan here, if need be, of guys that are already going to be familiar with their players, familiar with their teams, that if, when, whatever it happens, of moving on from Billy Donovan, Dan Craig, a guy who a lot of people think would make a really good head coach, maybe he's ready to take over if that's the case. Or Wes Unseld Jr., again, with how things went when he was in Washington as the head coach, you may not look at that, but this is something to kind of look at before, because I do think that both these guys, in some ways, could have found jobs where they could have been on teams that actually are clearly going after playoffs or going after the championship. And maybe they see in this team that there can be more competitiveness here, or they're seeing a chance of, hey, maybe this is their path to getting a head coaching job. So that's something to look at for as well in this. But overall, the Bulls finishing 10th in the Eastern Conference. And like I've said this many times before, I'm not somebody who I just thinks wholeheartedly the Bulls absolutely have to keep that top 10 pick. I would like them to, right? But I think if you see your young players take such needed steps forward and you're then competing for a play-in or a playoff spot, if these guys really hit big leaps, okay, you're there. Now, you still have to ask some questions on, okay, what's that realistic ceiling? Because if you're just fighting over the next few years for between the 6th and 8th seed, is that enough, right? But ultimately, we'll see what the season brings for the Chicago Bulls team. And there's a lot of optimism, more so than I thought once the Bulls made their moves this offseason than I thought would be coming into the season. And we'll see how that optimism pays off. But, in talking about rankings, that gets us to our next topic in today's episode, and that is Old Faithful Bleacher Report. I can always bet on Bleacher Report, even though I work for Bleacher Report, which is weird, to have some articles that either make me think or make me pissed off. Right? And just saying stupid shit. And and that's just me being 100% frank. I'm sorry. You know me. I'm not somebody who's going to bite my tongue for anything, no matter if I do some work for that company or not. I work for Bleacher Report Video. I don't work for Bleacher Report article writers. So that's a different thing. But the Bulls ranked number 2 on Bleacher Report's list of rosters that don't make sense. Now, a lot of Bulls fans are going to agree with that. And not to say that overarchingly, does the Bulls roster make the most sense? No. We just talked about the lack of depth at the big man position. We've talked before about having still veterans on this team, which is one of the things they pointed out in this article is, all right, how do Torrey Craig, Javon Carter, Lonzo Ball, Nikola Vucevic, how do these guys really fit what the Bulls are trying to do, especially when you look at Lonzo with his injury history, things like that. I think Lonzo's healthy. Like I said, at the bare minimum, his basketball IQ and passing is going to be a big, big positive for the Chicago Bulls. Like I just think that as well. Coming off that bench, to be able to have somebody, that if his knee can hold up, can play solid defense. But like I said, even more than that, the basketball IQ of Lonzo Ball is something that's going to help anytime he's able to be on this basketball court. Now, you do need your body to stand up to be that, but we'll see what that comes down to. But the Chicago Bulls ranked at number 2. The Atlanta Hawks ranked at number 1. I don't like the Atlanta Hawks, especially while they have Trae Young on that team. But they looked at this more so with saying that the Bulls are still trying to, they've pseudo gone into a rebuild, right? They've kind of ushered in a partial rebuild phase. Again, this is Bleacher Report's kind of wording, not mine, right? A rebuild phase where you still have Nikola Vucevic and Zach LaVine on this roster. And they also go on later on to mention Javon Carter and Torrey Craig. And so when it comes down to it, this roster is a roster that could make some sense. Now, I think that we've seen a nice mix of veterans and young players before, right? And that's been something that can work depending on A, what your goals are, and B, the play style. And I think when you look at it more so than anything else, the one thing that kind of does not make sense for like more of a Nikola Vucevic, because I still think Torrey Craig can be okay in a more up-tempo offense, not running gun, but a more up-tempo offense. That they cannot really necessarily fit. Now, I think Javon Carter doesn't fit just because Javon Carter's a bad basketball player, right? But then you start looking at the things that could make this roster make sense. And that is Kobe White, not only if he sustains the growth that he had last year, but also grows further. And I think that that's another part that we it's not just sustaining what Kobe White did last year is great. And doing it more consistently is great. I want to make no mistake about that. But if he's able to still have another gear where he can take his game a little bit further, that increases the ceiling for the Bulls even that much more. Modest Bucelis potentially being a steal for the Bulls, that goes without saying. If Modest Bucelis is a hit, that really does change a lot of things for the Chicago Bulls. And Modest Bucelis brings a lot of things to like about this Bulls team, about him as a player, right? He has some things as every rookie, especially in a draft class like Modest Bucelis. He's going to have to work out some kinks in his game for sure. That's why I've listed and talked about how important I think it is to see him after practice working with Peter Patton. But then again, they didn't mention Josh Giddey and Ayo Dosunmu, as I think these are two players that as well are huge parts of the Bulls roster making sense, and even Jalen Smith to a degree in that as well, right? These are things that can make this Bulls roster make a lot more sense in what they're trying to play. Now, you still need half-court basketball, and that's where the Vooch, Torrey Craig, could play a big role into this Bulls team, and especially, depending on how many minutes they play and how many minutes they play together. But having those players that make more sense in the half-court, you're going to need half-court basketball. There's nothing to take away from the need of being solid in half-court basketball in the modern NBA. And so you're going to need that aspect of things as well. So overall, does the Bulls roster make the most sense on paper? No, it doesn't. And, it has some things that you are absolutely looking at saying, well, if this works out, if this goes in this direction. And it's really up to the players and the coaches to maximize that. And really, I've said this before, Billy Donovan and overall this coaching staff are going to have to get in their coaching bags more than what we've seen really a coaching bag here in Chicago in a while, with balancing out this roster, balancing out the rotation, finding a nice mix of giving the young guys opportunity. Well, they have to earn it, right? But allowing the young guys opportunities, but also creating an environment where those young guys are in situations that make sense to actually grow and develop their game. And so that's the question, the bigger question that you have here for this Bulls team is not necessarily if the roster makes sense, because every roster has its its weird things, right? It's tweaks that it needs to be done. But can coaching get the most out of this? And that is where we had a great voicemail over the weekend, which talked about and asked the question like, is Billy Donovan the type of coach that's going to be able to elevate a roster? And that is a really big question for this Bulls team going forward, is that can you elevate what's here, right? And get it into a really good position. And that's something that we're going to be able to see shortly because games are around the corner, people. We're going to be talking about basketball games sooner rather than later, so I'm looking forward to that. All right, before we go, I want to get into a interesting trade idea that was put forth by Eric Pincus over on Bleacher Report as well. And he talked about how the Chicago Bulls can get involved and be the third team in a trade between the Lakers and the Washington Wizards. Now, I've talked about this before. This being able to be a third team in a trade and take on, because usually if you're taking on some bad salary, you're just taking on pieces that other teams don't want, it eventually gets you a little bit more draft assets that you can use going forward in the future. Now, in this trade, again, the Bulls are getting none of the main pieces. So this isn't just about the Bulls getting main pieces, right? This is about the Bulls getting assets back and how it fits towards what they're doing. In this trade, the Lakers will get Malcolm Brogdon, Jonas Valanciunas, and Javon Carter. We're ridding ourselves of the ball-headed hoe. And the Washington Wizards will get D'Angelo Russell, Gabe Vincent, Jalen Hood-Schifino, and Christian Wood. Now, I don't care about those two teams, so it comes down to, also they'll be getting Cam Reddish, the Washington Wizards, and a 2029 first-round pick that's top 5 protected and 3 trade exceptions. Now, in this deal, the Chicago Bulls will be getting Johnny Davis, Patrick Baldwin, and a $1.2 million trade exception. Now, Johnny Davis and Patrick Baldwin are two players that are still very young. They're just drafted, I think, within the last 2 years. They're still very young pieces. Johnny Davis was the number 10 overall pick in the 2022 draft. He played 78 games in that time, career averages of 4 points per game, 39.4% shooting, and 28% shooting from three-point range. Not great. Even in the G League, he averaged 10.8 points per game. Not amazing there. Patrick Baldwin is another player who's drafted 28th in the 2022 draft as well. And this is a guy who has shot 38.1% from three-point range in 38 games as a rookie for the Golden State Warriors. So this would be the Bulls getting two fairly young pieces, right, and only giving up Javon Carter, who is 29 years old. Now, this would be kind of fall in line with what the Bulls have done in their subsequent moves of getting young players that were first-round picks or picks in previous drafts that still have a lot left to show, right? Now, I'm not thinking that Johnny Davis or Patrick Baldwin are going to turn into big-time hits for the Chicago Bulls. Honestly, in Patrick Baldwin, yes, he's younger, but you have a player in Chris Duarte that plays a similar position and role that I would much rather see get those minutes than a Patrick Baldwin. But again, it's the Bulls ridding themselves of a player that didn't work, bringing in two young pieces that, hey, if you trust your development, maybe you take a look at. If nothing, they move on. You don't sign them. They become restricted free agents. They go on elsewhere, and you move on. No, it's, again, another one of those no real risk and no outward reward either for the Bulls. And so some would say that the Bulls are just spinning their pieces. And that could be that as well. But again, ridding yourself of a veteran with a guaranteed contract that then you don't have to pay again with two younger guys, maybe that's something. Again, it's one of those things that I think at this point, people are looking for angles. I can understand the angle that you can look at this for the Chicago Bulls. But again, it's not a deal that I'm looking at and I'm saying I'm not moved by, but it would kind of fall in line with what the Bulls have done before. Patrick Baldwin Jr. is, I think, a player that, again, for a low-risk type of move, is a player that may be worth looking at but then again, we got a lot of wings on this team. Now, he's 6'9", 220 pounds, so he offers kind of more forward versatility than what we've seen before. But this is a guy who, while he shot 38% from deep his rookie year with the Golden State Warriors, he shot the ball 32% from deep his sophomore year. Not great there, right? So, again, I'm just looking at this and saying, okay, it is what it is. But let me know what you guys think on this deal. Again, it's not really a rumor deal. It's more of a idea from a writer. So take that for what you will. But I will say this. If the Bulls are going to start selling off pieces, I wouldn't mind the Bulls trying to get involved in a 3-team trade. I just wouldn't mind it. And so you can see what happens there. You can get some more assets back, get some money, whatever it comes down to, and we'll see what happens. But guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you guys are following the show at Bulls Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, bullscentralpod@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related, but that's thanks to you guys. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See red if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.